Hello YouTubers, this is Cessnaace back again with another 10 video ads video, this time concentrating on LaserDisc. And in this batch of LaserDisc that I have to show you are quite a few releases from MCA DiscoVision. Now, MCA DiscoVision was the very first company to manufacture, distribute, and sell LaserDisc. They released their first LaserDisc in 1978. And remember, it was just late 77 that JVC had launched the VHS video cassette format. And 75 was when Sony launched its Betamax format. So you already had 3 incompatible formats when LaserDisc was launched. But it could have been a lot worse, because in the 60s, every major manufacturer of consumer electronics of any size were developing home video formats, because they foresaw in the future that people would want to collect movies. Unheard of back then, but that was their idea. And if they collected movies, they would have to have something to play them on. So they figured they would make their money by making the players. The studios, with one exception, did not see eye to eye with this idea. They were making a lot of money selling movie packages to local television stations. The second television station I worked for as an operations engineer was an independent when I first started working there. So they had a lot of airtime they had to fill. So they were buying every movie package they could get their hands on. And what few packages they didn't get their hands on, the other independent station in town got. So the studios saw that home video would drastically harm the revenue stream from selling movie packages to studios, because if people had their own copies, they wouldn't need to watch them on television and sit through commercials. What they were failing to foresee was the money they could make off of the discs or the cassettes. Because in the 60s, there were companies that were developing both video cassette and video disc formats. At least 5 formats I know of. A lot of the formats that were being developed didn't make it to market. In the UK and other parts of Europe, they got a format we didn't get, a video cassette format called Video 2000. But in any event, the first year's LaserDiscs were in what we now call CAV, or constant angular velocity. This gave them a maximum duration of 30 minutes per side. About a year in, CLV was developed, constant linear velocity. That upped the maximum duration to an hour per side. However, the first players that Magnavox and Philips had manufactured, not all of them would read all of the CLV discs, because the CLV mode hadn't come out yet. That's why you have some movies like Steven Spielberg's Jaws released by DiscoVision 4 times in just a 2-year period. They released 2 CAV versions and 2 CLV versions. Now, they didn't indicate CAV or CLV back then. They would put either standard play for CAV or extended play for CLV. But the early releases didn't say anything, but that's where they generally put it. If you look closely, you'll notice that the artwork that's on it is actually a sticker. Which begins all the way down here and goes all the way up and over to here. You can see the outline of it. Some DiscoVision titles were released in various packaging configurations. Many titles were released in a box and then subsequently re-released in a standard jacket. This is one of those releases. This is a CAV release of the Blues Brothers. And while it took several years for VHS and Betamax to add stereo to the format, LaserDisc had stereo from day one. And now eventually MCA got to the point where they were losing so much money that they went with one of the recommendations that had been made by their engineers, and that was to get other companies involved in making the players and the discs, because they foresaw it as a very expensive proposition, and it would be too much for just one company to handle manufacturing the discs and just one company manufacturing the players. So they had approached a couple of companies in Japan, Sony and Pioneer, and convinced both of them to build LaserDisc manufacturing facilities in Japan and LaserDisc player manufacturing facilities in Japan. It was at this point that DiscoVision said, we're losing a ton of money. A typical movie would, they envisioned originally, go for around $10. But the defect rates were so high, on some titles as high as 90-95%, that it was costing MCA as much as $300 per copy, because they were going through so many defective discs to get one good copy. And what they also found was, after they took that good copy and by the time it made it to the hands of the consumer, it may not be so good by then. It would have deteriorated, sometimes to the point where it wouldn't even play. So about 2-3 years into the format, MCA finally said, enough, we're getting out. We're killing the LaserDisc format off. Pioneer said, now wait a minute. You enticed us to get into this. We spent millions of dollars building disc and player manufacturing facilities. We're not giving up on this format. So they wound up buying MCA's DiscoVision plant. It was shut down, completely retooled, and that became Pioneer's American plant. Now, during the transition, when their American plant wasn't making anything because it was being retooled, you had discs being made in Japan for DiscoVision. And those discs will say on the jackets sometimes, but usually on the labels, manufactured in Japan for DiscoVision Associates by Pioneer. Or Universal Pioneer, excuse me. By Universal Pioneer. The only reason I can think of for them coming up with the word Universal in that title is because Universal was owned by MCA. But eventually they changed the name, got rid of Universal Pioneer and changed it to Pioneer. Now, a lot of the non-movie titles were never re-released on LaserDisc. Some movies were never re-released on LaserDisc. For example, Bustin' Loose was a DiscoVision release that was never subsequently re-released on LaserDisc. That was one of the discs that was manufactured in Japan by Pioneer for DiscoVision. It's in a DiscoVision jacket. It was just made by Universal Pioneer. Anyway, Bernadette Peters in concert. A lot of things that we take for granted now were started back in 1978. For one, chapter indexing. And LaserDisc would be the only format to offer that function until DVD came around. Most of these discs, by the way, came from yesterday and today out at the flea market. Hot Shots. The thing I like about the Fox video releases, they tended to have a lengthy liner notes on the back of the jacket. CAV, or standard play. Now CLV, constant linear velocity, had problems with video crosstalk and so forth. And so when Pioneer took over the format, they told both Philips and MCA, send us all of your documentation. Every known problem you've come across and everything you've tried to correct the problem. The result was that Pioneer created something called CAA, Constant Angular Acceleration. Now CAA discs are never marked, or were never marked CAA. They continued using CLV on CAA discs. And it was rather neat that the way that CAA was developed and designed, they could come out with discs that had longer capacity. I believe the longest one was 70 minutes. But nobody used them. And I don't know why, because there were some titles that only went over the 2-hour mark by 7-8 minutes, which necessitated the manufacture of 2 discs, when if they had used CAA 70s, they could have released just one disc. And I know I'm Deborah babbling, and I'm probably not making any sense. HouseSitter. Okay, this is the only one in this batch that came from ABC Lasers. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Now, as I believe I mentioned, there were a lot of DiscoVision titles that were not movies that not only were never re-released on LaserDisc, they were never re-released anywhere, any format. I don't know if this is one of them, but this is another one with a sticker on it over the jacket. Jacques Cousteau, The Unsinkable Sea Otter. To the flea market we go. Joni Mitchell, Shadows and Light. This was a very early pressing for Pioneer's Japanese plant. Although it was released more than once. I believe it had 2 US releases and 2 Japanese releases and releases in other countries. Now, this release was offered in both CAV and CLV. It's my cell phone going off. Modes. The CAV version has 1 track less than the CLV version. Thank you. I know I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. Oh, this one came from ABC Lasers too. I can't record a video to save my life without the phone ringing. Kill Cruise. The music of Melissa Manchester. Okay. Until next time, stay awesome.